Well, hello there. My name is Vladimir Miletic, and I'm a psychotherapist and a life coach and a meditation instructor. Um, and Welcome to this series of lectures on constructivism. As a therapist and as a coach, I use constructivist psychology as kind of the backbone of everything that I do. It's a worldview that, in many ways, kind of informs the way I see people, myself, how I interact, and how I work. Because constructivism sounds very complicated, and often constructivist books tend to be very technical, and that's off-putting to many people. And I'm often asked about constructivism, like, why do you choose this? What's in it for you? Isn't this just too much intellectual nonsense? Don't you people hate reality and stuff like that? And in order to kind of inform those of you who are interested, I've decided to create a series of hopefully short lectures, although you never know with me since I'm prone to digressing. But let's stick with short lectures where I will explain different aspects of constructivist psychology and philosophy. This first lecture is going to be about the kind of general constructivist worldview. So when someone asks you what constructivism is, I will hopefully give you enough clear information so that you can give them a one-sentence answer. Let's get started before I start digressing for no particular reason. So these are some things that I want to cover here. There are a lot of things written here, but I will be short, I promise. This is like Constructivism 101. First, I want to tell you a little bit about how I stumbled across constructivism and why it became so important to me. I want to talk about the general constructivist worldview, different flavors of constructivism. I want to talk about a philosophy called constructive alternativism, which is a bit of a mouthful, but it's not as hard as it sounds. I will address some critiques of constructivism that I feel come from a place of really complete misunderstanding of what constructivism is. And then I will try to point out some benefits of adopting a constructivist worldview. For me, being a constructivist is not even that I find the theory fascinating, which I do, but more than that, it's about the benefits it has for me as a person, as a private person. It's how it shapes my choices, the inner peace that I get from adopting and internalizing these ideas. So let's get started. So this is me on the right. I'm not putting myself on camera here because, I don't know, I'm not a big fan of being on camera, and I don't think it's kind of relevant. So yeah, let me know if you disagree. But here's my story with constructivism. When I was in medical school, I was absolutely convinced that I was going to become a pathologist. I loved pathology, like forensic pathology, any kind of pathology. It was very systematic. It was structured. There were clear rules to follow. It was really exciting and fascinating. A lot of things left to discover. So that's what I thought my path would be. Then came psychiatry, and I was just blown away. It really kind of resonated with me, except that I wasn't too thrilled with the approach to psychiatry that we were taught, which was mainly this biological version of it, where you prescribe medication and then say goodbye to your patients until they come back in a month or so, to see if they're doing better. I have nothing against medication. I find that they have their place in treatment, so I'm not some raging anti-psychiatrist, but that approach simply didn't really resonate with me. I thought there was a lot more to be gained from actually listening to people's stories, because it was the stories that I found fascinating. Some stories that were psychotic or just very unusual, I would find to be just deeply meaningful. And I didn't really get that appreciation for meaning in my medical school. So I decided to look at psychotherapy and see if there are some forms of psychotherapy out there that actually kind of give me a framework to understand these stories from the point of view of those people who tell them. So I wasn't so much interested in giving people labels and diagnosing them as this or that. I was kind of more interested in understanding, like, how do you end up with this set of problems? How do you end up telling yourself this story of your life? I was always a very curious person, even outside of medical school and outside of the field of mental health. I always like to know how things work. And one thing that I've learned over the years is, if you want to know how things work, you can't project your ideas onto these things. You have to really figure out how they operate. And the same applies to humans. Like, if I want to understand someone's experience, I kind of have to look at the world from their point of view. When we were taught about psychotherapy in medical school, we were taught mainly about CBT and its different versions. And while CBT offers practical techniques that can be useful and that many benefit from, I found it to be very reductive and, frankly, to an extent, offensive. If I come to therapy and someone tell me, listen, friend, this story that you lived with your entire life, that's just irrational, I will walk out the door, because I will not be called irrational. Like, even if I hear stories that don't immediately make sense to me, I know that my life story perhaps doesn't make sense to everyone, but it does make sense to me. Even when I don't understand someone's life story, it seemed ridiculous to me to think that they somehow distort their own life story. They live and create their life story by living. So I needed a theory, a psychology that would certainly incorporate the practical aspects of CBT, which I appreciate because they're useful, but I needed a more comprehensive approach to humans. And then, as every nerd does, I looked at the training centers for different types of psychotherapies that I had around me. I bought a book about each, and I read all of them. That took a bit of time, but it was really fascinating and very interesting. And at the end of that kind of journey that lasted a couple of months, I had settled on two different, very different theories. One was psychoanalysis, and the second one was constructivism. There is something about psychoanalytic language that I find just fascinating. And to this day, I have a lot of respect for psychoanalysis, and I read quite a bit of it. But psychoanalysis, at the end of the day, still does the same thing that other approaches do, which is that it kind of imposes a framework onto people. It has its developmental stages, and then it roots certain problems in certain developmental stages. For example, this is obviously a very reductive approach to psychoanalysis. But my point is that psychoanalysis is normative. It tells you what's clearly pathological, what isn't. It has an idea of what our development should be like. And while I find the narratives that they tell to be rather entertaining and fascinating and very intelligent, that's not what I was looking for. I was looking for a method that would help me understand people, but without labeling them as being disordered in one way or another. I wanted to look at people's problems from their own shoes. This was, I guess, a personal kind of value of mine. And constructivism actually gave me just that. One specific kind of constructivism called personal construct theory. The very fundamental assumption of that theory, and I will make lectures on it as well, so I will give you a systematic approach and overview of this theory. But the fundamental idea was that if you actually want to help someone in psychotherapy, coaching didn't exist when personal construct theory was made, but the same applies to coaching as well. You cannot project your own ideas or any specific theory onto these people. You have to look at their experiences in a way that makes sense to them. So constructivist psychology sees the point of its very existence in understanding how our clients see the world. Our job is to map out our clients' meanings, not tell them what something means. And I really like this, because it meant that this theory wasn't a theory so much as a meta theory. So a theory that allows me to dissect someone else's theory about themselves. I hope this didn't come out as complicated as it sounded to me. But basically, it was an approach to human beings that would allow me to see them as they see themselves, and then find solutions to their problems in a way that made sense to them. So I wouldn't have to prescribe them anything. I wouldn't have to tell them what to do. I wouldn't have to tell them what something means. Instead, we would form a partnership together, and we would figure out what that means to them. I felt that it was an approach that actually respects every individual's kind of specific idiosyncratic journey. Because even though people will, let's say, take something that we all deal with, like burnout at work, right? So we can say, I'm struggling with burnout, and maybe 10 of you will agree with me. But how we came to this point, what decisions led us to choose to work so much so that we end up with burnout, or even what burnout means to us, can be really very different. Some people have to be overworked because, or rather, they choose to work a lot because they have bills to pay or because they have kids. Some people are terrified of seeing that they have nothing else in life except for work, so they bury themselves in work. Someone else might work overtime because they feel like they have to please their boss because they seek validation. So every person really has a different theory, a different set of ideas behind this thing that we call burnout. And constructivism gives us a method to understand each person's journey. And as soon as I figured this out, I thought, well, I was a constructivist all these years, I just didn't know it. And so I went with constructivism. So what really attracted me to the theory is that it emphasizes how different every person's lived experience is. And it really basically tells us that if we want to help someone or ourselves, we have to understand where our beliefs came from, why we developed them, what was the alternative, why was this choice better, and then to tell a new story, to take those experiences and rearrange them and tell a new story that will be unique to that person. So that aspect of individuality and respect for everyone's psychological content, this kind of attempt not to impose anything, not to put yourself in the position of power over your client, is something that really resonated with me. Because as a person, I would not stand anyone putting themselves in a position of power over me. I just don't legitimize such behaviors. And I also don't want to exercise any kind of harmful power in relationship with anyone else. And constructivism is kind of, it starts from this point that we have different, let's say, sets of skills. I'm so sorry about the noise. It was very quiet until I decided to record this, and then naturally cars had to start passing by. But back to the issue of power. Constructivism says, as a therapist or a coach, I have the methodological skills. So I know how to help people change. I know how to help introduce clarity into people's lives. On the other hand, you are an absolute expert in your life story. So you're the one who has the facts. And it's only when we come together as equals in good faith that we can actually achieve a result. So in constructivism, the therapist or the coach is not this omniscient God who knows how to resolve every issue and what's behind everything. And the client has as much power as the professional that they're working with. And I quite like this, because as a person, I appreciate respecting other people's experiences. I appreciate equality. And when these two come together, along with this emphasis on understanding every person's specific experiences, I thought constructivism was really perfect for me. And as my training went on, and as I started getting to know constructivist psychology in greater detail, I was really only validated in my belief. Over a decade later, let's not get into specific numbers because I'm not getting any younger. I still believe in constructivism even more than I did when I first started this whole journey. And it has become not just this theory that I use at work. Constructivism quickly became kind of my modus vivendi, how I live my life. So there's that. That's how I became a constructivist. I hope that wasn't too long, but for some reason, I felt the need to share at least parts of my story. So now let's forget about me and go back to constructivism. The first thing that you need to know is that constructivism is not one thing. It's more accurate to talk about constructivisms rather than constructivism. So there's many flavors of constructivism. And to make things more complicated, all these constructivists tend to disagree on many things, sometimes bitterly, and sometimes these different forms of constructivism cannot be reconciled. They're simply so different that on some basic level, they're not really compatible with each other. So whenever you have people criticizing constructivism with these blanket statements about all constructivists, you can be sure that they have absolutely no idea what they're talking about. I will give you a few examples of different flavors of constructivism later on. But for now, the best way to think about constructivism is to see it as an umbrella term that really encompasses a wide variety of theories. And what they have in common is just really one thing, which is how they see the nature of knowledge. Some go deeper, some are less deep, but this is one place where they all meet. Constructivist theories across the board think of knowledge as something that is being made, something that is being constructed by human beings rather than acquired. So for constructivists, for example, science is not discovering some deep truth about the nature of reality. It's about creating theories, generating knowledge that explains natural phenomena that we're able to perceive. As scientific theories grow, we kind of open up more of reality to ourselves. So there's this recursive relationship between reality and our construction of it, which means that our constructs determine what we can see or what we can perceive as being real. And then in turn, reality will constrain our constructs and tell us, okay, this doesn't work or this works. But we'll talk about this in subsequent lectures, don't worry. But for now, the basic thing to remember is that all constructivist theorists share this one common thing, which is knowledge is constructed. It's the product of human activity, of individual activity, and as collective activity as well. An example of that would be, for example, science or religion for that matter. These are systems of knowledge or philosophy that have evolved over time through collective efforts of many, many people. So that's the distinguishing feature of constructivism as opposed to some other ways of thinking, which is that we believe that knowledge is made and not discovered. Right? So that's about it. That's the core of what constructivism is. And now I will try to explain what the implications of this worldview are and show you different flavors of constructivism. This is a very nice state. So the man on the picture here on the left is Richard Rorty. He's an American philosopher, a neo-pragmatist. He wasn't a big fan of labels, so I don't even know if neo-pragmatist would be something that he would have appreciated. He was by some considered to be a constructivist. I am one of those some. But when he was asked, he said that he doesn't really understand what that label means. But that was a very typical answer for him, because when you would tell him that he's a neo-pragmatist, he would say, yeah, but what does that mean? Or if you would tell him that he's a skeptic, he would say, sure, but what does that mean, right? So he wasn't a big fan of labels. However, this sentence from a book that I really like called Contingency, Irony, Solidarity, this statement here, I think, encompasses really nicely and without a lot of technical language what constructivism is all about. Here's what he says. The world does not speak, only we do. The world can, once we have programmed ourselves with a language, cause us to hold beliefs, but it cannot propose a language for us to speak. Only other human beings can do that. So what he says here is that there is a world out there, but the properties of that world is something that we make up through language. We tell stories about the world, and some stories fit our observations and our experiences, so we keep them and call them true. And what he says is that when he says that the world does not speak, it means that the world itself doesn't really care how we interpret it, and isn't really interested in what we expect it to be. It just is something. It's not really knowable to us because the world has no language, right? For us to know things, to communicate, to exchange ideas, to assign meaning to things, we need to have a language, a set of constructs, a set of concepts, depending on what type of constructivism you're into. But we have to have these linguistic structures that will help us articulate something about the world. So the meaning resides within us, right? So we are the ones who give meaning to the world. The world can cause us to hold beliefs, he says, only when we have a language, because beliefs about the world exist in language. Or I would say it's maybe more accurate for us to say in our constructs. In the next lecture, we'll talk about constructs. So hopefully it'll be kind of more easier to understand what I mean by that. But if you prefer, you can use the word language for now. So the only reason why we can say anything about the world is because we have a language. And restrictions of this language, its limitations, basically tell us how many different interpretations of the world we can derive. As our culture and we as individuals, as we grow and develop, our language changes, which means that our beliefs about the world also change. So not only is knowledge constructed, it also changes all the time. Because we constructivists believe that knowledge is constructed, we tend to be skeptical about the possibility of obtaining objective knowledge. There's another pragmatist. The reason why I mention pragmatism so much is because a lot of constructivist psychology owes a great debt to pragmatist philosophy, specifically to John Dewey and William James. But Peirce, another pragmatist, once said that objectivity is what everyone who participates in a scientific endeavor agrees to at the end of the inquiry. So basically, the closest that we constructivists can come to the idea of objective knowledge is what we all agree upon after we thought about something and discussed it. So it's kind of a widely shared belief. Because we believe that knowledge is constructed, because it's a story that we tell ourselves about the world, then we can never really know if that's objective. There is no way for us to jump out of our constructs and see if our constructs are true. Because language exists in our minds and between us through dialogue, but the world isn't really interested in our language, doesn't care much about it, right? So because we're very skeptical about the possibility of having objective knowledge, we try to talk about knowledge differently. We don't ask ourselves so much, is this true? And instead, we ask ourselves questions like, is this useful? Is this giving me the results that I'm expecting? Because in science, we say that something is true when we make a prediction, conduct an experiment, and then we see that the results of this experiment align with what we predicted. That's exactly how we constructivists think, only we know that our hypothesis that we test in an experiment is always constructed, but we also construct the results of the experiment, right? So we don't think that an experiment is a source of objectivity, but it is a way to verify whether our assumption about the world, this kind of piece of knowledge that we want to check, whether it's sustainable, whether it's useful, whether it does its job. So as constructivists, we like to evaluate knowledge based on how useful it is, or based on what implications it has, and whether these implications match the world we wish to see or the world that we do see in front of us. So constructivists, by definition, then have to be anti-dogmatic. Because we have to consider all knowledge as hypothetical, we can't really hold on to beliefs and be fanatical about them. A constructivist really has to be an open-minded person, because there are things that seem true to me, things that I hold to be true for me, let's say, things that I cannot see differently at this time. But because I'm a constructivist, I know that this is the best that I can do now to make sense of the world. And then when I meet a person who has a different worldview than mine, I don't think of them as being wrong. I think of them as having a different worldview. And I'm curious about that worldview because it can enrich mine as well. In other words, I cannot hold to any belief with 100% certainty. Therefore, I have to remain open to evidence that my worldview may not be the best one. I find this to be incredibly liberating, and maybe the most beautiful thing about constructivism as a whole, which is that there are certain things that I believe, but I also know that I will perhaps change my mind at some point. I change, my thinking changes, reality changes, the world evolves. So knowledge is always a process. It's always a work in progress. We never reach this point where we say, okay, now I'm done learning, I'm done changing, I've learned everything there is to be learned. And I also cannot be a smug ass and consider my worldview superior to anyone else's. I can note the differences and the similarities. I can disagree with them. I can have my reasons to disagree. I don't even have to have reasons to disagree. But all the while, I know that my disagreement is just based on the best that I can do right now. And that tomorrow, if I learn how to do better, I will change. So constructivism gives us a kind of cognitive flexibility because we don't become entrenched in our beliefs. We're always, to an extent, skeptical about those things that seem even obvious to us. And this hypothetical nature of knowledge applies to self-knowledge as well. So when we talk about who we are, how we see ourselves, so our construction of ourselves, we always think of it as constructivists as something that is subject to change. So every iteration of me has an expiration date. In fact, who I am is a product of many things that happened to me over the course of my life. So when I say I am this or that, what I'm actually saying is this is a theory that I have constructed out of all these things that make up my previous experiences, right? So this is how I summarize my life story. My values come from my culture, from my family, from my experiences, my private experiences. And as my experience unfolds, as I become more experienced, I will maybe have to change how I see myself. And for constructivists, there's really no shame about changing. We don't have to be jaded and stuck in our beliefs, because we know that it's all just a story that we're telling ourselves, that we are always much more than that. And in fact, it's between this discrepancy of all this unknowable potential that we are and this story that we tell ourselves, it's this gap that keeps us developing, that allows us to be creative, to reinvent ourselves. So constructivists are, if they're consistent, and most of them are kind of radical if you think about it. it makes us question the notion of what it means to be authentically you. I can say that I'm authentically a constructivist now because this worldview makes sense to me. It resonates with me. It informs my choices. It directs my decision making. It's the framework through which I think now. But I can't say that this is the essence of me that will remain unchanged forever. Right now, and for the past decade, I had absolutely no reason to doubt this. But as my experience of life unfolds, I have to keep an open mind. I cannot be a closed book. In fact, in constructivist psychology, we often locate problems precisely where people's self-constructions, so how they see themselves, have passed their expiration date, but the person refuses to change it. And then what we have is this kind of a friction between the experience that they have in their everyday lives and how they continue to theorize about themselves. They have to actively ignore or twist reality to fit their theory instead of it being the other way around. That you form your idea about yourself based on the reality in which you live, based on who you're surrounded with, what they'll let you get away with, the choices you make, the needs that you have, right? So when we refuse to change and our knowledge has reached its expiration date, that's where we actually start having psychological problems. In other words, in constructivism, we necessarily think of identities as disposable. This makes constructivism a bit of a divisive theory, because these days you have people who like to identify as many things, and constructivism says, fine, identify away as much as you like, because identities are useful as means of social recognition. But as soon as you mistaken your identity for yourself, for constructivists, you've kind of lost it there, right? You're not exactly being very precise. An identity is a theory about yourself. In case of identities, because they're a social currency, it's something that is offered to you and something in which you recognize yourself. But there's a difference between me recognizing myself in something and being that. So in constructivism, we treat identities as being really very disposable. But because identities are how we're seen in society and often how we choose our actions, then we have to talk about identities. And there are people who like to think in different terms, and then they also end up not liking constructivism. So that's also one of my favorite things about constructivism, is that it's a very subversive theory. It really questions a lot of the modern psychological and philosophical and even political ways of thinking. Constructivism is deeply emancipatory, and this doesn't tend to sit well with people who like safety and security, and who find that security in thinking that the world is this fixed place, that the order of things never changes. Because for us constructivists, the world is always in flux. It really never stands still. So now now that you have this general idea about what constructivism is, I want to give you a few people who are constructivists, but who have very different ways of approaching constructivism. So the first person is Ernst von Glasersfeld, who was an Austrian philosopher. He created a theory that is called radical constructivism. It's a fascinating theory, and I will give you a quote of his a little later on. So I don't want to get into this too much right now. I could even make a specific lecture on each of these. Next to him is Umberto Maturana, the Chilean biologist, whose constructivism is fundamentally biological. It's abstract, dense, and absolutely fascinating, but he's a biologist, and that's exactly how he approaches this. So when people talk about and criticize constructivism for ignoring reality or being relativistic, I always have to roll my eyes, because you have a biologist who is very much a materialist who is a constructivist. So there is that flavor of constructivism as well. The third person here is my favorite person, possibly in the world ever. Well, hopefully none of my family members will listen to this. Anyways, his name is George Kelly, and he created the theory that I like and that I, let's say, follow and work with. It's called personal construct theory. And the distinguishing feature of his theory is that he tends to look at people as kind of amateur scientists, as these active agents that test out all kinds of assumptions about the world, and then as they go about their lives, and then create theories about themselves and the world. So Kelly's psychological constructivism is by far my favorite one, and that's the one that we'll spend the most time elaborating. And the last person is Jean Piaget, who I doubt that there's a psychologist out there who doesn't know who Piaget is. He was also kind of more, I wouldn't say exclusively biologically oriented, but he did write a lot about how our cognitive apparatus develops from how we as biological beings, among other things, interact with the world. There's also another person that I didn't include here, which is Michel Foucault, who is kind of very well known, either adored or hated. But Foucault was also a constructivist to a degree, or maybe a better way to describe him is a social constructionist. And he will also tell you that knowledge is produced, not discovered, that it's something that humans make. But unlike Kelly, for example, he's going to tell you that knowledge is socially constructed, whereas Kelly is going to tell you we certainly live embedded in a culture, but knowledge is deeply personal. Meaning is not given to us, it's something that we create through our lives. So while Foucault might tell you that people are created through these discourses, as he says, Kelly would say people are created through their own choices. As a constructivist, I can't say that one is true, the other one is false. I can see value in both. However, as someone who actually works with people for a living and helps them change, I side with Kelly because Kelly's approach is more useful to me. In my experience, it works. And unlike Foucault, Kelly gives us a way to change things, whereas Foucault, I don't know, except to make a revolution, I don't know what else we can do to change these kind of impersonal discourses that float around and shape us. So while I don't negate that his approach has some merit, it's not to my personal liking, because I work with individuals and I help them change and live better lives. Does that mean that I believe that we have to be obedient to culture and society? Absolutely not. I think we should irritate people, make unpopular choices, as long as they're aligned with how we see ourselves and where we want to get. So Kelly's approach would be my favorite. But the reason that I'm kind of saying all this is just to show you that there are many ways in which constructivist thinking can operate, and that these ways are not necessarily compatible with each other. For example, while Kelly and von Glasersfeld might have some similarities together, the guy next to Kelly on the left, Maturana, would probably not share that much in common with Kelly. Piaget and Kelly might agree on some things, but disagree on other things. So that's why I said it's best to think about constructivisms, so in plural, rather than just one constructivism. When I refer to constructivism in future lectures, I will refer to case number 3, which is George Kelly and his psychological constructivism, unless I explicitly say that I'm drawing on someone else. So here's how, for example, radical constructivism looks at knowledge. This is also, I've quoted this because I feel like most flavors of constructivism would share this idea. So I'll just read the pink part here. Knowledge can now be seen as something which the organism builds up in the attempt to order the as such amorphous flow of experience by establishing repeatable experiences and relatively reliable relations between them. This is what I mean when I say that constructivists can be hard to understand, because they employ very strange language. And this is actually a more palatable example of constructivist writing. But what he actually says here is that reality, as best as we can say, is this amorphous flow of things. So this kind of shapeless, vague stuff that exists outside of us, and that we create knowledge by observing things that repeat themselves. Kelly explicitly says this. We create constructions of reality by kind of noticing themes that repeat themselves. So we notice these themes and how they relate to other themes, and then we tell stories based on these observations. That's why we say that knowledge is constructed. So let me just kind of go skip one sentence and then go here. He says, that means that the real, quote unquote, world manifests itself exclusively there where our constructions break down. I find this really interesting. And when we get to a lecture where we'll talk about constructivist treatment of feelings, you will recognize anxiety into this. Basically, what he tells us here is that because our experience of the world is mediated through constructs, through knowledge, this structure that we erect, we only come into contact with this amorphous, shapeless world when our constructions break down. And when our constructions break down, we experience this as bouts of very intense anxiety. I will have a whole lecture on this because it's a very, very interesting approach and a very practically useful approach. But think of it this way. Whenever you feel terribly, terribly anxious, this is where you've come into contact with reality. But because anxiety is so vague, it tells you that reality itself for us is always vague. For us to make sense of the world, we need a layer of constructs between us and the world, right? So that's what he says here, and I'll finish the quote. But since we can describe and explain these breakdowns only in the very concepts that we have used to build the failing structures, this process can never yield a picture of a world that we could hold responsible for their failure. In other words, when our constructions break down, we build another set of constructions on the foundations of the previous ones. So our constructions of the world evolve, but they never come from the world directly. They come from our previous constructions. So you make sense of your experiences in the future by connecting them to your experiences in the past. That's what it basically means. So what about reality? Now, contrary to popular and incorrect opinion, constructivism isn't a form of relativism. If by relativism you mean anything goes, reality can be whatever the hell we want it to be. So that's just not what constructivism says. And there are even reputable philosophers out there who seem to think that constructivism is nothing but thinly veiled relativism. And I'm here to tell you that this is not true. This is simply not true. Constructivism doesn't negate that external reality exists. It doesn't even negate that this external reality has some properties. Constructivism points out what I hope should be obvious by now. Even though we are an intrinsic part of reality, we actually never perceive reality directly. The closest we can get to reality is through our perception. But our perception is really not direct reality. Your eyes, what you see, is not a mirror of external reality. It's really an electrical activity of the cells at the bottom of your eye that is then reconstructed in your brain. And for this activity to be reconstructed in your brain, you have to rely on previous experiences, cultural norms, and so on. So we never actually touch reality, right? We are, in a way, removed from it. And it's our meaning-making processes that shape that reality for us. So reality itself is out there, it exists, it's something, but it's not something that we can ever know directly. And without constructs, it's anxiety-inducing. And when I say anxiety, I don't just mean mild anxiety, I mean an explosion of anxiety. And we need constructs to make sense of it, to give it meaning. Because when we give it meaning, then we know what to do with it. So in a way, you can say that constructivism contains this wisdom of not knowing, of no understanding that whatever we say or do is based on our assumptions about reality, on our experience of reality, but that's not the same as reality itself. So we're not relativists. We don't think that you can, identify as a bird and then fly out the window. That's not what we say. In fact, I've made parallels between the scientific method and constructivism several times, and that should tell you something, that every construction of reality has to be tested against reality so that you can see that it works. We will never know if it's true, but we will know if it works. This is exactly how science operates. We know that for some things, like if you want to send a rocket to the moon, you can do it with very simple physics that is not compatible with quantum physics, for example. And then what scientists do intelligently is say, so we'll use this set of laws for big objects, we'll use this other set of laws for small objects. We don't have to say that one theory is absolutely true or absolutely false. We can simply find where it works well and where it doesn't, and use it where it works. So that's what we constructivists do. That's the nature of constructivist thinking. So I'm sorry, I realize now that I'm almost preaching, but this kind of charge of relativism is something that really bugs me because it's obviously unfounded to anyone who actually reads constructivism. So now I'm going to present a constructivist philosophy, an approach to the world. It's called constructive alternativism, and it was devised by George Kelly, the pixelated gentleman on the picture here. So without going into Kelly's very technical vocabulary, since this is not for psychologists or for philosophers, this is for everyone, Kelly basically tells us that everything that we can think about or perceive can be reconstrued in infinitely many ways. Right? If it can be reconstrued in infinitely many ways, it means that it can be used in infinitely many ways. Different points of view will obviously lead to different actions. If you have a book in front of you and you like to read like I do, then when you see a book, you'll think, oh, great, here's something else I can learn. And your call to action will be to pick up the book and read. If you don't like to read, you might see that book and think, here's something I can put under the table and balance it so that it doesn't move, right? Both valid ways to construe a book, but lead to very different actions. Not every, I have to underline this once more, not every construction of reality is equally good. In other words, you can't simply choose to construe a wall as air, because once you try to walk through a wall, reality will give you a sobering response to your construction. So you will be forced to change your construction of a wall if you initially thought of it as being the same as air. So we do, in other words, we test our constructions. They don't exist in this vague mist of things. If a construction doesn't pass the practical test, if it's not useful in everyday life, we simply have no reason to keep it. This applies to things like walking through a wall. This applies to social interactions, to social norms, to identities that we have floating around our societies. It applies to our spiritual beliefs and so on. So a construction to be acceptable has to work. And even though in theory we can reconstruct everything in infinitely many ways, this doesn't mean that each of these will work. We have to keep that in mind. Motion is another very important concept in constructivism. So for constructivists, specifically for Kelly here, the world is always in motion. He kind of even says in one place that the universe exists. He actually says is existing, so progressive tense, by changing with respect to itself. He says that humans are forms of motion and nothing more. So we're these parts of the world that change. What makes us different from parts of the world like walls or stones or mountains is that we're able to construct other parts of the world and then change it and influence it a little bit. But we are all deeply and fundamentally interconnected, and we're always in motion. When we talk about connections between mindfulness and Buddhism and constructivism in the future, I will come back to this point. Because the world is always in motion, that means that we can't stop changing our constructions of the world. They must keep up with the world that changes. As we change our constructions of the world changes in turn for us, because our constructions give meaning to the world. And then when our meaning changes effectively for us, subjectively, the world has changed as well. Changing constructions opens or closes certain avenues of action for us. We experience the world directly only when our constructions of it break apart. I already said this, I just wanted to buttress it kind of because it is an important point. And that experience is really just very intense anxiety, and reality, yes. So what does it mean to live as a constructivist? Overall, if I had to summarize the constructivist approach to living, I would say that every constructivist has a curious approach to life and to other people. We're not threatened by people who are different than us. Personally, if you ask me, every therapist, regardless of what school of thought they belong to, really must have that, or a coach. If you find other people's beliefs threatening, then maybe you should go and find a different profession. But if you're a constructivist in any area of life, you kind of approach other people's perspectives with curiosity. You try to understand them. You're willing to engage with them. We have a certain degree of detachment from our perspective. You shouldn't confuse detachment from dissociation, because that's not the same thing. Detachment just means that as we use our constructs, we don't think of it as objective reality. We think of it only what we're able to make sense of right now. We see ourselves as works in progress. I will skip this final vocabulary thing just so that I don't make this too long. We'll come back to it in 2 or 3 lectures anyway, so you'll learn what it is. But we see ourselves as being work in progress. This is why sometimes when I work with clients and they want to tell me that they disagree with something that I said, or if I did something to upset them, they're always confused when I welcome their perspective and actually try to adjust, and when I don't react emotionally to what they say. And this is because of this. I am always a work in progress, which means that I'm going to say stupid things and I'm going to do the wrong thing from time to time, but then I'll learn. I never do the wrong thing because I think it's the wrong thing. I do it because I think it's good. And then when I test that and see that it sucks, I try to change it. This kind of openness really is necessary for one person to consider themselves a constructivist. So let me just try to summarize this. We have this openness towards what's different. We're willing to engage with different perspectives, and we don't consider our own perspective to be true, just as best as we can do right now. And we always see ourselves, other people, and the world as something that is work in progress. And this is about as concisely as I can explain what constructivism is. One way to think about it is as an antidote to perpetual uncertainties of life. Because when you adopt a constructivist point of view, you don't actually expect certainty. And knowing that everything you think now and how you see yourself or the world will change, weirdly gives you a sense of certainty. So you give up certainty only to gain another kind of certainty. It's a way to reduce suffering, because when you have to say goodbye to a part of your identity, to some of your values, to some of your beliefs, for constructivists, this may be a sad thing, but it's not a cause for suffering because we knew that this was going to happen. We expect things to change. We think of our values as tools. We think of our social roles as tools. not as our essences, not as something that is unique and authentic and forever ours. At the end of the day, I see constructivism as a method for finding an authentic life, whatever authentic life might mean in the moment. So it puts you on a continuous quest of making sense of this world and finding your place within it. When we say authentic, or when I say authentic from a constructivist point of view, what I really mean is something that you find meaningful right now, not some everlasting essence, because as constructivists, we don't really believe in that. Which is why we believe that people can change. If I believed that people have these unchanging essences, I think I would find another line of work. I have to believe that people can change who they are in order to help them change. Hopefully that's obvious enough. Anyway, I'm going to stop here. Next lecture will be WTF is a construct, and I'm going to try and clarify what we mean by construct, because these words like social construct, personal construct, they're used all over the place by everyone in very messy ways, and I'm going to try and explain it to you in a very clear way, and fingers crossed that I succeed, because I don't think it's as abstract and vague as many people present it to be. So once again, welcome to this series of lectures, Why Constructivism, and thank you for sticking through the first one. See you in the next one.